Eddie Corwin started his career as a sustainable building consultant in New York City before joining Google as a sustainability partner. At Google, Eddie focused on sustainable building operations, naturally, including energy, air quality, circular materials, and water. Eddie spent his last 5 years at Google creating a corporate water stewardship program. He is on the board of the Tuolumne River Trust, which kind of circular economy there, and is a member of the California Beaver Policy Working Group and the California Process-Based Restoration Network. He is also a big proponent of process-based restoration and beaver reintroduction. Eddie is currently a consultant specializing in corporate water stewardship and involved. He's going to talk to us about Project EEager. Good to go here, and then this just announces.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I am very excited to talk to you about some green infrastructure and its impacts on water, and that is the amazing American beaver. And actually, beavers have been having quite a moment down here in the South Bay in Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of identification of new beavers showing up in Los Gatos, and just a couple weeks ago, the first beaver kit, just 4 months old, showing up down in the Baylands. So it's actually a pretty exciting time. So I am here to talk about Project EEager, which is a machine learning tool that identifies beavers in satellite imagery. But of course, before I get into that, I need to talk about why beavers, and give a brief background on beavers themselves. So there are two types of beavers currently living in the world, the North American beaver and the Eurasian beaver. They are cousins to each other. They cannot interbreed. And beavers are large aquatic rodents, 60 to over 100 pounds. They are strictly herbivores. They love willows and cottonwoods and alders and herbaceous plants. And what people most know beavers for is for their dam building. They build dams to create ponds, and they also build lodges. And the reason that they do this is for their protection. They are very clumsy on land. They waddle around slowly, but they're very swift in the water. So if they can build themselves a pool, they have a place to retreat to when predators come by looking for a tasty treat. And they have their lodge that has that underwater entrance that they can get in and out of and protect themselves. And these things, the dams and the lodges, are quite sturdy. Grizzly bears cannot break through the lodges to get to them. Before Europeans came to North America, beavers were just about everywhere. And they were in almost all the waterways, and there were a ton of them. And North America was known for having exceptionally clean water and these very wide river systems that were not single channels like we're used to today, but were very complex, had all sorts of different flows and side flows and channels and a whole lot of complex debris in there. I really wish I could have seen what the waterways looked like back then. But then when Europeans came, it came at a time when beaver fur hats were all the rage. And this was a time before umbrellas, and beaver fur is barbed, and so when it gets wet, it holds its shape really well. So if you have a beaver fur hat on and it's raining out, it's going to keep a stiff brim and protect you from the rain, whereas other furs will start to droop and eventually, you'll get wet. So beaver fur was very much in vogue, and if you were coming to North America and you failed at your other endeavors, you could fall back on the fur trapping industry. And so beavers were nearly wiped out from North America, not quite, but it got close. And now they've made a pretty good comeback, especially in the Midwest and the eastern states and in Canada, where there's a lot more water. The waterways are closer together and it's easier to disperse naturally and repopulate. But here in the American West, they're around, but they have not rebounded in quite the same way, likely because there's a lot more space in between our river systems. It's a lot more dry. It's just harder to naturally get around. So why do we care about beavers? they provide a myriad of benefits to our water systems, to the ecosystems, and to humans themselves. So the first one I'm going to start with is water supply. Beavers build dams. We already talked about that. And dams store water. It depends on the size of the dam, but if you need a number, an average sized beaver dam will hold about a ½ an acre foot of water in the pond itself. And then that water pressure will sink down 2 to 5 times as much water down into the ground. And depending on the landscape you're on, maybe that'll go down into the aquifer, maybe that'll come back downstream later on. But basically, a ½ an acre foot being stored with a lot more of that being pushed down into the ground. So if you've got a string of beaver dams like this one in this picture, you can count up, there's at least 10 dams there, if not more. So, 5 acre feet of storage in a very short stretch of creek. And here's what you see, in a picture showing that on the left we have a stream without beavers, and you can see you've got a little bit of groundwater, shallow water. You've got that zone coming, that cone underground, and on the right you see a stream with beavers, and that's because they build their pond, and not just the pond itself, but they're also building channels to go out and forage for food, and they are constantly dredging the bottom of that pond. They're bringing the mud up and using it to patch their dam. So you're getting an ever expanding pond laterally, but you're also keeping that depth and also keeping that soil churning so you don't get, you get that percolation to continue. And so in a drought condition, without the beaver dam, you get a lot more dry grass coming up to the edge of the stream, like we're used to seeing pretty much all over California. But when you have a beaver dam, you've got a much wider green area to keep the vegetation and healthy through that dry spell. Impacts on water quality. One of the big ones, I think, especially for water managers who own storage, is sediment collection. Beaver dams are tremendous at capturing and storing sediment. If a beaver abandons a dam, over time it'll fill up with enough sediment that it becomes a wet meadow. If they continue to live there, they'll, like I said, continue to dredge it. But they store a lot of sediment. And so if I am a water manager and I can help affect the land upstream of my reservoir, I would want a lot of beavers up there helping to capture that sediment and keep the sediment out of my reservoir, especially post-fire, when you get those ash flows and a ton of sediment that could, in one season, make its way downstream and take away a large portion of your storage. The ponds themselves are also great for nitrogen removal. Ponds create a lot of edge effects, and edges are where the magic happens. That's where a lot of the best quality life and habitat exists. That's where a lot of these natural processes take place. So up to 40% nitrate removal from beaver dams. And as I mentioned before, that water that sinks down into the ground comes up, a lot of it will come up downstream later on. And studies have shown that in a beaver complex, which will be several beaver dams together, in a beaver complex, you can get a 3°C drop in temperature, which is wonderful for the fish. Beavers are known as a keystone species. They create amazing, amazing habitat for all sorts of wildlife, from mammals to fish to fowl to invertebrates to protozoa, everything. I mean, they create really wonderful habitat, and that is because they're creating all of these different edge effects and complexity. Some of the best fishing holes you'll ever find are around beaver dams. And about 10 years ago, there was a little bit of a fight between the fish community and the beaver community, where folks were saying, especially the salmon, hey, if beavers are building dams, they're blocking the migration of fish upstream, or the flow of fish fry downstream. There's no longer that contention anymore. They have co-evolved for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And there's an old adage that says, beaver taught salmon how to jump. And basically, in the springtime, when the flows are high, the adult salmon have no problem jumping over those dams and getting upriver. And then later on, the fry that are coming down, it's been shown they can either wiggle their way through the dam, which is great refugia from predators, or, these beaver dams, there's water flowing around and over and all sorts, so they can kind of make their way around and over. They have ways of getting around it. And here are a few photos that have been taken at beaver ponds of the charismatic megafauna that everyone gets excited about, you know, bears and mountain lions and wolves and mink and all of that. So not only do animals come there for, you know, food and water, but they'll use the dams themselves as land bridges to get across the stream. Flood control, a really another important one that, you know, we have some flood managers either in the room or a part of this group. And beaver dams, one dam in and of itself is not going to do a whole lot, but beavers don't build one dam. They build many dams. And they do that because they know that many dams will help keep their ponds full through a drought, but many dams will also dampen a flood surge as it's coming downstream. And so again, if you're managing flood control, having a lot of beaver dams will really help to dampen that. And I've got some images to show this. So here on imagine this is one continuous stretch here where we've got beaver dam complex on the right and no beaver dam up here on the left. And then we're going to show a flood surge kind of coming through. So here comes the flood wave making its way downstream. It hits that beaver dam and starts to spread out. It loses a lot of its power, and as it's going downstream, it's a lot slower moving. And so upstream, as we see all over California, you got erosion, soil loss, scouring, that could very easily become like a 6-foot cut in the channel that's going to make it really hard for that water to reconnect with the floodplain later on. Down at the beaver dam, because you have a much wider area here, you've got these channels, that storm surge is able to get absorbed a bit and take a lot of that power out of it. Especially then if you have, you know, 10 of these in a row, each one of them is absorbing some of that power. Now, of course, in big storms, sometimes dams do breach and they'll get broken, but that's why beavers build many. You know, one of them breaks, hopefully the next one can then absorb some of that, that power. If there's several in a row, it's less likely that they're all going to get breached in a big storm. Fire. Fire is a huge one, and as you'll see later on this project, we worked with Dr. Emily Fairfax as one of our main science advisors, and she studies beaver and fire. And so she has looked back at mega fires over the last, I think, 10 or 15 years and compared sites with beaver dams and without beaver dams to see how well the site reacted to the fire and how well it can rebound. This is a photo of the Sharp Fire in Idaho. And what you see, it was a massive fire, very hot, you know, basically denuded the landscape around it. And then that is a beaver complex right there in the middle. And you can see it is green, it is wet, the plants look happy. Up a little bit where it's much more narrow, the fire could easily have jumped that part of the stream to move on, but here it likely did not. And what Professor Fairfax likes to say in her research is that her research has proved that water does not burn. Yeah, you have to do years and years of research to prove that, but water does not burn. And so when there's enough water on the landscape, it does not burn, and the vegetation can survive. What's also really amazing about this is that it's been shown that this is refugia for animals that are stuck in the middle of the wildfire. They can go here, it's going to be hot, it's going to be smoky, it's not going to be nice, but you will survive because there's water and it's not going to burn there. And I don't have the proof behind it, but there's been anecdotal stories that in some of the fires in California, firefighters have gone to beaver complexes as a place of refuge as well in the middle of a fire. We think about here, you know, we had the fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and if you've ever gone hiking in the redwood forest there, which many of you probably have, it's very common that you don't really see openings in the canopy. And there's steep streams running down and all that, but if there were beaver back on the landscape, and in my opinion, it was very, very likely that back in the day, there was a lot more openings in those redwood forests because there were beaver taking down trees, creating these dams and ponds, but those could act as effective fire breaks. They can act as refugia, you know, really could play a role in future fires. And as I mentioned before, the post-fire ash flow can be huge, and you want to stop that. Here's a couple other pictures with beaver and without beaver of that same fire. So you can really see a big difference. And then lastly, you know, beavers with process-based restoration can really be an incredibly effective technique for restoring meadows in California. Process-based restoration, particularly what we call low-tech process-based restoration, is a type of restoration that really tries to use the natural processes and systems to do much of the work. Instead of bringing in heavy machinery and rocks and dirt, you're basically mimicking what beaver do. You're building these small wood structures that help the water to spread and reconnect to the floodplain, and allowing that kind of natural process to take over and hopefully do a lot of that work. Now, this takes human power, and humans are terrible at building these types of structures because we're not, we didn't evolve for millions of years to do it, and so they fail. And so humans have to kind of keep up with it, every few years and go back and maintain them. But if beavers exist in the system, or they're brought back into the system, that's the maintenance crew that will never ever give up. They will maintain those systems. They'll come and say, who built this one? It's terrible. Let's take that one out. But this one here is pretty good. Let's build on top of it. And they will continue to maintain that day in, day out throughout their life, and as long as they are there. And this is a picture of a place called Doty Ravine, which is in Lincoln, California, up near Sacramento. And it's all grazing land around here. And on the left is what it originally looked like. I guess that's around 2016, where there was basically a small single stream coming through. They were trapping beavers out of here for decades. So they stopped trapping the beavers and built some beaver dam analogs, man-made beaver dams, which the beavers then took over. And you have an incredible, it was something like a 3,000% increase in wetted area. So really incredible. All right. On to Project EEager, the machine learning component of this. And actually, before I dive into that, I'd be remiss to not say that California Fish and Wildlife has actually just this year launched a new beaver program where they are making it a little more difficult to get beaver depredation permits. So instead of just being able to get a permit and kill a beaver that's causing some human conflict, you now have to look into conflict management techniques. But they're also starting to do some of their first beaver relocations that in the last like 50 years or so. In the 70s, they would drop beavers out of airplanes over wild area, and that was how they reintroduced beaver, and it worked okay. But yeah, with parachutes, they'd put them in a box with a parachute. When it hit the ground, it would release a door, and the beaver could waddle out and hopefully not get eaten right away. So not very precise, but it did what it did. So they're starting to do some relocations now, and they're starting this year with their first two on tribal land in the Maidu up in Plumas County, and the Tuolumne River tribe down south. So I'm very excited about that. All right, Project EEager. EEager stands for Earth Engine Automated Geospatial Element Recognition. And yes, that is a backronym. We came up with EEager before we came up with that acronym. Basically, using Earth Engine to find things in the imagery. And this is our team. This is a 100% volunteer project at Google. So we found folks, we came up with the idea, found folks that had the skills and were interested in helping us. So we've got some machine learning, remote sensing, software engineer folks, and then there's Professor Emily Fairfax, who is our science expert. And our challenge is to find beaver dams in satellite imagery. So Professor Fairfax, who studies fires, one of the things that her students do for hours and hours on end is scroll through Google Earth satellite imagery looking for beaver dams. And it's quite tedious, but it's a lot cheaper than going into the field. So first they do that, they identify some locations they want to go check out, and then they go into the field for a shorter time and helps them save money. But it is a tedious task to scroll through an entire waterway looking for beaver dams. So if we could do it with a machine and even be 50% accurate, that would save them a lot of time. So these are all beaver dams, and if you've been looking at the picture for a few minutes, you're probably starting to understand what a beaver dam looks like. We as humans are excellent image recognizers. So that was to do that at scale was the challenge, and the goal was to really expedite the ability to find these, really starting on the research side of things, but there's a lot of other applications that we're learning about here. So we needed to create a model that worked at scale. We had inputs including RGB imagery from satellite imagery and a high resolution slope model, digital elevation model. And then we needed lots of training data. Whenever you build a machine model, you need a lot of training data to teach it what it is trying to do. In this case, teach it what it's looking for. And like I said, we humans, we look at all 4 of these pictures and we think beaver. But when you're teaching a machine, especially a very simplified model, you know, it looks at this and you can teach it that that is beaver. But then you give it this image and it can be like, whoa, whoa, I have no idea what that is, you know? So that's a very, very simplified model. We're trying to create a more complex model like that called a convolutional neural network. And so it's not only looking at the individual pixels themselves, but it's looking at those pixels relative to their neighbors and all the other information that's in that image. So it's starting to understand not just the pixel itself, but how it fits in relation to the other ones. And so these are the 2 types of imagery that we fed it. We fed it the red, green, blue on the left that we're used to seeing. And then on the right there is the digital elevation model. That's basically, you know, a whole bunch of lines showing different elevations. So the model itself knows what color it looks like and how steep it is. And then we needed to get a lot of data. And so we reached out to, you know, other professors and other groups who are studying beavers or who might have this information, and basically, you know, identified all the beaver dams, pulled out a 25 meter by 25 meter patch, did all sorts of rotating and flipping and other things just to build our data set, but also make sure we weren't teaching it specific orientations, and fed it that information. We also needed negative dam information, so not only do we want to teach it what a beaver dam looks like, we want to teach it what not a beaver dam looks like. And so to do that at scale, we had this model where we basically created a donut around known beaver locations and randomly sampled in there. There is some room for error in there, but we were working only in the American West, and as I said, they're pretty scattered, so we were confident that we wouldn't get too much bad data in that, and it was quick. So here are the training sites in what was green. You know, you can see kind of the highlighted area there. That's where we got training data, and then we tested it out at all of those squares. Those were our evaluation polygons. So we trained on about 13,000 positive IDs and about 56,000 negative IDs. And then we ran it. And so this is a site that Professor Fairfax calls Damageddon. If you've looked at enough of these pictures now, hopefully you're starting to identify the beaver dams. Here's what Emily hand drew to identify all of the beaver dams. And then we ran our model on top of it, and this is what came out of it. So it was pretty darn good at identifying the beaver dams, and or you could say the beaver influenced habitat, right? Because it's not putting a line on the dam, it's basically putting a square over it and saying, I'm pretty confident this is a beaver dam. So it did pretty well. There were some areas where it did not do well. One of the most interesting areas of false positives was cul-de-sacs. It loved cul-de-sacs. And if you think about it, you do a little mind experiment here. What is a cul-de-sac? It is a circle with asphalt in the middle that could look like dark water and a nice white cement sidewalk around it that could look like dry sticks. Humans build cul-de-sacs that look like beaver dams. So it's not perfect. It works pretty well. I'm not going to be able to pull this up now, and I should have put the actual URL, but I can share it with Dennis and get it out to you all. But basically all of those square sites, they're up on a website where you can look at one of those slider images to see, you know, hand-drawn dams versus what our model does and see how well it performs. So, you know, we're continuing to improve the model itself. One of the things that we're going to do now is we're going to run EEager across all of California. I had mentioned before, California Fish and Wildlife is starting up their program. One of the things that they need to do is understand the current range of beavers in California, and they do not know the current range of beavers in California. They have some information, but it is very sparse. And so we're going to help them out by running the model in an iterative approach over all the counties in California. And so each time we run a county, we're going to then do a QA/QC, and then feed that information back into the model. So every time we run a county, the model should get even better and better at understanding California beaver dams, and then it'll help them understand the current range. We also want to use this model to be able to track changes over time. And what's really awesome is to help quantify beaver influence. There's a lot of other folks out there who are not only studying fire, but are studying the sediment capture, that are studying the water storage capabilities. So if there's a model like this that can help them identify the current range or the shifting range of beaver, they can then run their analysis to help quantify some of these benefits. Or in a place like Tierra del Fuego down in Patagonia, where beavers were introduced to help spur a fur trade and have been devastating the landscape, maybe a model like this can help eradicate them where humans make our terrible, terrible mistakes. I'm not going to go through all these, but there's some lovely resources if you're interested, some books, books for adults, some books for kids. Media coverage, which is actually a little old at this point, and a whole bunch of papers, peer-reviewed scientific papers talking about the information that I shared with you today on why they're good for water quality, supply, habitat, and so on. So, thank you all so much.
Beaver questions? I still have in my mind salmon jumping over beavers and their work.
Yeah. Yes?
What's the source of your satellite image?
The source of the satellite image, so this was using Google's proprietary image data set, which is a mix of Landsat, Airbus, all sorts of other data sources. So Google sources imagery from all over, and then they kind of create a best of data set. And so that's what it's using right now. We've talked about and have toyed around and done it, but haven't retrained the model on public imagery. The tough part there is that we are able to get 0.2 meter resolution, and there's not a whole lot of public imagery out there that is at 0.2. And to identify the beaver dam, that's a good resolution for it. Yeah. Oh.
So this is great. Can you pivot the model to maybe say, here's a great place that doesn't have beavers, that ought to have beavers?
Could we pivot the model to help identify suitable habitat? Yes, that is possible, right? I mean, we would need to train it on suitable habitat. The tough thing is most of our landscape right now needs work to become suitable habitat. It needs a little bit of that process-based restoration. There are models out there. One of them is called the BRAT model, Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, that assesses the suitability of this habitat. And so one thing we've talked about is, could our model feed into the BRAT model? Could you run the BRAT model, then run EEager and see where it overlaps, and then kind of help each other improve both of our models? Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, excuse me. Do you have an idea about how many beavers we really should have in the state of California? Because you're building it out, and at some point you get to where you've got too many beavers.
Right. I mean, million-dollar question. What?
And will they vote?
And will they vote? I mean, gosh, we're never going to get to the point where we had, pre-colonization beavers. And the main reason for that is that we as humans love to live in the same places that beaver lives, river valleys, flat areas. So no, I do not have a number for where we should be in California. I love beavers and everything they do, but I am not kind of that single species person. If we have enough beavers in California, I have no problem reopening, trapping or hunting, or as long as we have very viable population. So I don't know what that number is. I hope we could get to it at some point. But if there are too many, as we've learned, humans are great at eradicating animals, so we can always get rid of them in some way. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of how ambitious the Fish and Wildlife program is for restoring?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, if it gets me.
Yeah, how ambitious is Fish and Wildlife? So for decades and decades, they had absolutely zero ambition, but they have really turned around. And they've hired 5 new staff, and I've met all of those staff, and they are very excited and very ambitious, but they work within a big state bureaucracy and have, competing interests. So They recognize these benefits and they really do want to get beaver back into the landscape. They're really starting on tribal land and CDFW owned land, and also really targeting the headwaters. You know, one thing I didn't mention, but as our snowpack starts to diminish and we have more flashier systems, we want to keep as much of that water up in the mountains as possible. And so they're really starting up there as well. Yeah. Did we have one more? Yeah.
Yeah, to my knowledge, the beavers that we have down by the bay don't build dams, there's no gradient. So your system isn't going to catch these guys. Now, there are a lot of those, does it matter for your system?
Yeah. Not all beavers build dams. I mean, if given the chance, they would, but they don't when there's not the right conditions. So if you're in a big river like the Sacramento or the San Joaquin, where it's down lower in the valley, any dam they build is immediately going to get washed away. If you're down here on the bay's edge, you might not have the right material, or you might not have the need. If they have deep water, there is no need to build a dam. So they're probably not going to do that. If we could get, here on the peninsula in particular, if we could get beavers up into the mountains in the headwaters, that's where they would build dams. That's where they would hold those storm surges back, help with the flooding down here, and then also help with that groundwater recharge, you know, because they're keeping it up in the mountains. It's going to flow down underground and help with the recharge. So no, our model does not pick up those beavers. They're certainly out there. I don't know what the ratio is. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Eddie.